castellano hoy, la última vez, sí, perdónenme. Me llamo Daniela Ziemann, soy también la curadora artística de la Fundación TVA 21. Y con mucha alegría, con gran alegría, inauguramos hoy la última expo, la última parte, la segunda parte de la exposición Ecologías de la Paz, con una docena de obras de artistas nuevas, de artistas que no hemos visto. Y los invitamos a celebrar con nosotros, con todos los eventos que hemos preparado para hoy, para mañana también. Y, hay una luz increíble. Pero también pasar con nosotros 2 minutitos, como pensar un poco sobre la paz, ¿no? Y, ¿cómo decimos? ¿Qué quiere decir la paz en un momento tan duro, en una situación de guerra, como sin fin, ¿no? Tenemos guerra en todo el mundo. Y me parece que la expo es como una reflexión profunda de tradiciones pacíficas que nos inspiran para el futuro. Y la paz para nosotras, para mí, no indica una paz negativa, no es la ausencia de la guerra, no es solo el momento donde no va a continuar la guerra permanente, pero es una paz imaginativa, es una paz transformativa y poética, es lo más importante. Y las obras que hemos añadido a la exposición, obras de Heraclito, de Ayerson de Heraclito, de Nikita Kadan, de John Aconza, de Rachel Rose, Noemi Pérez, obras muy potentes, muy importantes, nos cuentan sobre la visión artística de la paz, una visión que registra y que recuerda, una mirada de los testigos, una mirada del documental. Pero también las obras indican una paz un poco diferente, una paz un poco más profunda quizás, no sé si profunda. Es la visión de la paz del corazón, del cuerpo, la paz espiritual, decimos, ¿no? Es una visión espiritual, poética también. Y hoy, en este momento, me parece que necesitamos ambas, ¿no? Necesitamos la visión crítica con la visión poética, decimos, ¿no? La visión del corazón. Es lo más importante, ¿no? Cómo unir el ámbito crítico con el poético, con el artístico. Y como en cada inauguración hemos preparado una serie de eventos extensivos para hoy y para mañana. Empezamos con la charla de Manthia Diawara. Manthia, por favor, ven aquí conmigo. Damos la bienvenida a Manthia Diawara. Y continuamos mañana con charlas, con conversaciones, con performances. Hoy también tenemos una serie de performances. Y bueno, nada más. Espero que... No, voy a introducir a Manthia. But in English.
I was listening to your beautiful Spanish.
Oh. I don't think they are doing. So I've only met Manthia today, but it's already been a pleasure. Manthia is a filmmaker, he's a writer, he's a critic. He is, somebody whose words and images have been with me for a very, very long time. He's a distinguished professor at NYU, and he has gifted us a beautiful, beautiful film that I hope you had the occasion to see. If not, please do check it out. And it's a film on the philosophy and legacy of a very important woman Angela Davis, a woman who's changed quite a bit across her life. No, she took on a lot of personas, a lot of manifestations, but I think her philosophy was always sort of very, very stable and firm. And I would say she had an abolitionist vision of peace, if not something else. And what I find very beautiful in Manthia's films, but particularly in A World of Greater Freedom, that it's a film that engages all our senses, and it engages our intellectual curiosity as well. And it's a film that in its aesthetic language slows us down. You know, you get very slow. Not that the film is slow, but it slows us down. And in this way, in its sort of aesthetic language, in its discursive language, it does its reparative work. It repairs our soul, it inspires, but it shows us also the possibility of beauty. And here I was thinking about Christina Sharp's mentioning of, beauty as a method. Today is sort of my poetic moment, so back to beauty and beauty as a method. And she says, and I found it very beautiful, she says, as a method in producing the kind of worlds that we might actually want to live in with other people. Thank you, Manthia. You have your microphone. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela. After a wonderful presentation, salute like this, and then introduction, I don't know what to say. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm honored. It's a great honor to come this way. I once remember traveling to the Canary Island, and my dream has always been to come to this side of Spain. So thank you. I really appreciate it. What I want to do, I'll talk a little bit first about my project and then come to Angela Davis. I have been engaged recently in making films on philosophers of our time, because I think the world has changed. And that is a big cliche, because the world is always changing. But what happened, with the movements of decolonization, with the mechanical revolution, the electronic revolutions, the world came together, become connected in a way that was not predicted by the people who discovered the world. People, let's say, I'm a Francophone, and in the past, everything somebody from Mali does has to go through Paris in order to go to London, in order to come back to Ghana. But nowadays, you don't need to do that anymore. So if you agree with these general changes of the world, and I can give many examples, I think there are philosophers who want to describe to us the ways, but also the aesthetics of this new connected world, instead of leaving us in a world of binary oppositions, in a world of contradictions, a world of black and white. It became a world of relationality. And this actually was the subject of my first film with Edouard Glissant, One World in Relation. So these ideas are coming from Edouard Glissant, who basically said that differences as opposed to being opposed to one another, differences actually are necessary for creativity, are necessary for actually creating what Daniela was just talking about, beauty. Glissant also wrote about this notion of la beauté, le beau et la beauté, where you get la beauté, the beautiful, like in the museums that represent tradition, the conquest of the winners, and the reward of the conquest put in the museum, and all the other museums began to reproduce that. But when we go with differences, what we get is that we look for the emergence of le beau, the beauty. Beauty can be found in everything. So when these differences come together, what they produce is what interested Glissant. And then in the same tradition, I made a documentary also on Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, who is talking about how, he's going against this opposition of discourses. He's talking about truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation. He's, of course, looking at slavery, he's looking at colonialism, but he's looking at the Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutsis. How can we approach truth and reconciliation after situations like this? And of course, he's also the one who actually started this movement of, when we talk about reparation, which has been with us for a long time, and the relation to museums and sending objects back, he believed that we need to stop with restitution as opposed to reparation, because it's not possible to repair. So how can differences actually get together and talk about these issues? This is what led me to Angela Davis, and I will talk about Angela Davis because I think she is also one of the philosophers of the aesthetics of this new world that I'm trying to talk about. So for Angela, and for people like Edouard Glissant, for Wole Soyinka, they will say la première volonté de résistance aux effets des catastrophes, tellement profondément liée aux manœuvres de tyrannie, est une poétique avant d'être une politique. So this is really the first act of resistance is poetic before becoming political. This is what's important to them. Art is really where you provoke people's imaginary. You provoke their imaginary, let's say they come to the museum or they go to a music concert or they do whatever it is that they do. And then they go home either with something they learn or 10 days later, or let's say 2, 3 years, 10 years later, suddenly they remember that moment looking at that painting and it stops their quotidian. And then they begin to change. This was quite important to people like Angela Davis. And I was giving an anecdote last night about Black Lives Matter and how we went to, I was traveling with Angela to different universities that NYU has. They have one in Madrid and Florence and different parts of the world. So we went to Florence and to Paris, and Angela would give a talk, a beautiful talk in the way she knows how to do it. And at the end of the talk, people would raise their hands right away and they said, "What do you think about Black Lives Matter?" So, and then Angela will take 15, 20 minutes explaining what she thinks about Black Lives Matter and why in the United States, Black lives are the least important in every discourse, juridical, political, economic, and so on. So if Black lives begin to matter, then everybody's lives matter. This is the argument she would say. So, and then the situation with George Floyd happens, And then people in China, people in Africa, people in Spain, Córdoba, everybody starts saying, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And being the person that I am, I picked up the telephone right away and called Angela Davis. And then I started explaining this. You remember when he did this? He said, Manthia, stop, stop, stop. So we got that argument in the mainstream, in the consciousness of the mainstream. So let's look for another radical argument and talk about that. This is no longer our project. Let's move on to a new project. So that's Angela Davis. So these philosophers, they feel like fragility and weakness are strengths of grace and honor. Fragility, and Edouard Glissant will explain it later on when he talks about the poetics, la poétique du tremblement, the trembling thought, the trembling thinking. He's looking at, he's a European, Caribbean, black, was teaching in the United States, and he looks at the history of perspective, and he looks at the history of logic, and systems and systematicity, and he said linearity. He said, actually, the best way to know people is to tremble with them. Trembler avec le tremblement de l'autre. So this to him is not a weakness, it's not because you are afraid of somebody, but when you tremble with somebody, they tremble with you, and then you begin to create a connivance, you begin to create a complicity, you begin to create a way of actually your identities becoming. You're no longer a fixed identity. Because he said this logic, systematicity is a form of violence that actually is trying to reassure itself by always retreating into identity, into same, into fixity, into what is logical, into linearity, as opposed to when he tremble, he said, je peux changer en échangeant avec l'autre, sans me perdre ni me dénaturer. So when you tremble with them, you change, they change, you hesitate, they hesitate, and it doesn't mean you're afraid of them. It doesn't mean that you're losing your identity. It doesn't mean that you're not being yourself, but you are bringing the world together. This was quite important to Glissant, but also to Wole Soyinka, who was always saying, okay, you describe the other, Africa or Latin America, the Indian, as this, but now that the Indians, when behaving like you should at least recognize that they have a logic. So this was quite important to Glissant, to Soyinka when he's talking about the Yoruba way of being, which is equal to a French way of being, to a Spanish way of being. What we do is we put them together and put them in conversation. So this poetic of trembling was very important to Soyinka, to Glissant. Another point that Glissant brought up and that Angela Davis is very much into is what Glissant called geomorphism, like geomorphology. That is geography and geology, these thermodynamic ways of trembling as very important to our existence in the world. And here is what he means by this. When the study of the Anthropocene, the critiques from Dana Haraway to the present, we always talk about how man, by being the center of the world, wants to do everything in the image of man, and therefore has destroyed the planet. And now we have to figure out in environmental studies how to save the planet. So the Anthropocene studies there, how do we return it? People like Edward Gleason said, well, it's because people have not looked at the geomorphology. Because for Gleason, and then I think for many Caribbeans, for Latin America, the Indians, for Africans, something that is always with us is that, and I think largely destroyed this in the West. I'm more a Westerner. You see me changing from us as Africans or us as Westerners, because I'm a Western man, because for me, the West is a project. It's not a geography. It's not that you have to only come to Spain or go to France to be a Westerner. West is a project that you can use even against the West for me. And so when I move from one type of identity to another, I'm doing that deliberately. So Gleason makes the point about geomorphology by saying, he takes as example this mountain in Martinique called Mont Pelé, le Mont Pelé, which trembles and which erupts sometimes. And Gleason has a way of relating Mont Pelé to the Andes in Peru, but also to the Dogon land in Mali. He writes about this all the time and how they are connected. The point really is that not only for Gleason, but for people like Aimé Césaire, but again, for Gleason actually calls it naive thinking. For many people in the places that have not been destroyed by industrialization, by mechanization and so on, people actually speak to the wind. They understand the language of the wind. They understand the language of the water. They understand the language of the mountains. And they relate, instead of saying that they are the center of these things, they relate to these things. They know where to build the house. When, even still today in my area of Africa, every village, when you talk about the origin, you say that the first person went and then put their spirits or talk to the spirits under one tree. And then under that tree, they made a path. They will come and make a sacrifice, and nobody is allowed to have a plantation there. Nobody is allowed to dig a well there. So that became one unique space. And then another space would be for farming, and then different spaces would be for different things. But now all these things are leveled. When we take the Anthropocene of logic of the world. But the geomorphology, on the one hand, is asking us to look at life in that sense, where the landscape, and Lisa always talks about this, the landscape is a character. The landscape is not, just a decoration. It's not just when you do your painting, you have objects, and then you show a landscape and so on, and then you give it a name. The landscape is a character that enters in the story just like you have different characters in a novel. The landscape is as important like that. This is what he said. So let me tell you, he says, le géomorphisme. This is the thesis of it. Ramener les constituantes des humanités prises dans leur généralité à une géographie et à une géologie poétique qui les dépasse en les intégrant. So if I can give my poor translation of this, is to also bring our behaviors to a geography and a poetic geology, but that does not stop there, that goes beyond them. The spirituality of it goes past. Once these differences come together, the new thing that's produced is unpredictable. Whereas logic, systematicity is always telling you, if you put this data and that data together, then you get this. It's the unpredictability that people like Glisson are interested in. It's the unpredictability in the world and learning to live with the unpredictability as opposed to being self-assured and know what I'm doing. This is like this. So this is what is keeping people like Glisson alive still with us. So Glisson calls it la pensée naïve. And he said, l'espèce humaine a tendance à rendre équivalent et solidaire les balancements de son être et les mouvements du monde. Ceci a toujours été l'ambition des poètes. I repeat it again because for those of you who speak French, l'espèce humaine a tendance à rendre équivalent et solidaire les balancements de son être et les mouvements du monde. Ceci a toujours été l'ambition des poètes. Again, my bad translation. Human species tend to create similarities, equivalencies, and solidarities between their own movements and the movements of the world. That's always been the ambition of poets. It's like dancing like the wind. It's like flowing like the water. So you always compare yourself to these things as opposed to thinking that they are there for you. You are there with them and you are relating to them. The other thing that I want to say something quickly about is this whole idea of that really, because I was talking about Wole Soyinka's notion of truth and reconciliation. And in France now, there is a place in Nantes where they have recognized slavery as part of French history, and they had a monument to slavery in Nantes. And this was the struggle of Edouard Glissant was the head of it, but there were other people like Patrick Chamoiseau in the struggle. And they based the whole thing about shared memories. We have to share our memories. You know, in the US that I know well, I can't speak for Europe in this particular case. Sometimes some people will stop the discussion because they will say, look, slavery, colonialism, that's not my problem. My parents didn't have slaves. I don't have anything to do with this. And therefore, I cannot be interested in the systematic, the structural racism against Black people. Because I had nothing to do with this. But meanwhile, they are in America, they automatically, if they're white, if they're from Spain, they automatically become white in the system. And then the African American who has been in the United States for 400 years is never automatically truly achieving that position. So, you know, if you're from Spain, you say, but that's not my problem. So, and the Glissons are saying that there is a necessity to see together, la nécessité de voir ensemble ce qui vient là et s'approche l'un l'autre et se reconnaît l'un l'autre et par conséquent de l'urgence poétique et de l'urgence pratique levée parmi nous d'avoir à combattre ensemble l'oubli. It's urgent that we all fight against forgetting, against forgetfulness. Because forgetfulness, Glissance, is not a disease. It's a deliberate attempt to close yourself. To close yourself, I have nothing to do with this. In the society, this is not me. Talk to someone else. So they fight against this attempt to close oneself. And they say you cannot teach people how to remember, how to remember things. You present things to them through art, and then if they want to, relate with you, it provokes the imaginary. And I try to translate this in my own way again, to have to fight together against the will to forget, which leads us into an abyss of unimaginable auto-destruction. Because if we don't remember, we will always fight. If I don't remember your memory and you remember my memory, then we can only come and clash. We must remember all the injuries and scars left behind us by the abyss of forgetfulness. So it's the forgetting itself that becomes an abyss. So I will come now to Angela Davis. Why Angela Davis? Growing up in Mali as a young man, Mali, when African countries become independent in the 60s, they become independent either through socialism or staying with France, la communauté française, or the English and so on. And this is the 60s, and I was a young boy. And in forming a language for that independence, one of the things for people like myself growing up in Africa was Frantz Fanon, was Angela Davis, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba. These were the people who taught us how to create our independence. I remember this very hard statement that I teach in my classes now, where Frantz Fanon always said, il n'y a de culture que nationale. There is no culture but national culture. Because they were critiquing the negritude movement, who were saying, oh, our ancestors were kings and queens. Fanon, they were saying, no, pick up your weapons, you fight, and as you fight, you create your culture. So that resistance, that culture was very, very important to them. And I ended up telling people, maybe about 10 years ago, I said, Fanon taught me how to think, but Glissance saved my life. This is one of the things that I said. So Angela Davis's image was among those giants when I was growing up. And then when I was in high school, Angela Davis's image came again. And this image now came as style. The afro hair of Angela Davis, the shirt, and so on. And then I identified with her. Then I went to France. I went to Vincennes, and people my generation will recognize Vincennes right away. It was a radical university in France. And there again, I came from Mali, and anybody in Francophone schools in Africa, by the time you go to France, you know your Baudelaire by heart, you know your Mallarmé by heart, you know, Paul Éluard, and so on. So I went to France, many ways thinking that I was a Frenchman, and I was like everyone else. But when I went to France, they showed me that I was a black man who spoke French. So it just wasn't taking me too far. And then Angela Davis came back again because at that time I met a poet called Ted Jones. And Ted Jones actually, I met him at Shakespeare and Company, and This is a place where Gertrude Stein talked about the lost generation. American writers like Hemingway, they were all going to this place to get away from America for one thing, but to write. You know, Fitzgerald and so on, and Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, they were going there. Ted Jones is one of those people coming from surrealism and bebop. So Ted Jones told me one day, he said, look, young man, I know you want to be like me, but you don't have my talent. Nobody can be like me. You know, Ted Jones, like many African Americans, they all use Miles Davis as that model. Everybody wants to be like Miles. So he was the Miles Davis of poetry. So he told me right away, you can't do that. So he gave me Angela Davis's address, but not just Angela Davis's address, but Sonia Sanchez, Jen Cortez, and so on. So I said, yeah, right. So I took it and put it in my pocket and went to the United States and went to school and finished, and then went back to these addresses and met all those people, Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, and they all become my friends. They went from being my models and become my friends, basically. So it's through that friendship that I worked with Angela, I started doing things with her, and at the end of every talk of Angela Davis, I would say, oh man, Angela, you took me to school today. So she looked at me and said, what do you mean I took you to school? You always saying this, so stop that. I said, okay, let me make a film on you and I'll show you why you've taken me to school. So she agreed, and that's how the film came about, basically. So that's our friendship and everything, but I think, Daniela, will stop here. Okay, with your permission. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.